Okay, so I hope you can all see that. So thank you very much, John and Jeff and the Yorkshire Rewilding Network for inviting me along this evening. I'm going to talk tonight about, mainly about peatlands, obviously, but their condition to start with and why they're important. And then the work of the Yorkshire Peat Partnership, and a little bit about where we go next. And I hope you'll see that in their own way, and the work that we're doing is a contribution to the whole kind of rewilding approach to certainly working in the Yorkshire uplands. So I think the first thing to do is actually kind of explain a little bit about what peatlands actually are. In the UK, we have three types of peatlands. We have in the lowlands, we have a raised bog environment and fen. So you may well see raised bogs in a classic example in Yorkshire would be the Humberhead levels, which were actually cut for horticultural peat, but still have some really good raised bog elements. The fens, if anybody's been to our Yorkshire Wildlife Trust reserve at Pottrick Carr, then you'll see extensive fens there. And then blanket bog, which is pretty much what I'm going to focus on tonight. And the blanket bog, as the term suggests, blankets our landscape in the uplands across upland Yorkshire of the Dales, North York Moors and the Nidderdale A and B. Obviously much more widespread in Scotland. I often think of Yorkshire as the southern end of Scotland when it comes to peatlands. I've just put this slide in. I don't want you to kind of find this too complicated, but it's quite an important thing with peatlands and is part of their unique character. That peatlands are actually in two layers. So in good condition, you'll have a relatively thin layer of vegetation on the top, and that consists largely, or should consist largely, of things like sphagnum bog mosses, cotton grasses, some of the dwarf shrubs that you'll see, and this kind of layer of vegetation that actually holds most of the water, and the water flows through this top layer. But the peat itself is below this in what we call the catatoun, and this deep layering of decomposing vegetation is what forms peat. So this two-layer system is really quite important in a fully functioning peatland, but also in describing the current state of our peatlands across Yorkshire. And whilst we have got still fairly extensive areas of this double layered peatland, a lot of our peatland is now what we call haplothelmic. It's actually lost one of the layers, and it's that vegetation layer that has been altered or changed, which is then exposing the peat to the atmosphere, and that's where a lot of the problems start. So it's quite an important concept to just bear in mind as we go through the presentation. So why are they so special? Peatlands cover something like 3% of the world's land surface, but store something like 30% of the world's soil carbon. So as a carbon store, they are massively, massively important. In the UK, our blanket bogs are of a very specific vegetation type, affected by the fact that we are oceanic. So we're affected by the weather that comes in from the sea. And that makes the British Isles pretty unique in the type of Western blanket bog that we have, which only really occurs here, Ireland, and then other kind of Atlantic seaboard countries. So there's a little bit in Norway, a little bit in Portugal of all places, and some in northern Spain. So it's a very unique habitat that is extremely rare. It's rarer than rainforest communities. So we have a duty to maintain and look after our peatlands for the globe, I suppose, from a biodiversity perspective. But if you get in really close, I'm just getting a message that you might be losing some sound from one of the attendees, please let me know if that's becoming a bigger problem.
It's coming through loud and clear to me, Tim. So
okay, good.
yeah, most people are saying fine. So Steve,
Okay.
I think it sounds like it's at your end, I'm afraid.
All right, thank you.
Carry on, Tim.
So one of the things you'll find with a peatland, and at sort of first sight, if you go out onto some of the Yorkshire's peatlands, they actually look quite well, I won't say boring because I'm biased, but they look quite uniform in the way the vegetation covers are very sparse and very bleak. So, but you really have to get down on your hands and knees, which means you're going to get wet knees, and really get into the vegetation and see what you can see at ground level. And as soon as you do that, you start to see that actually it's almost like a miniature kind of forest environment in its own right. So you've got this blanket of sphagnum moss, as you can see in this picture, the sort of green color at the bottom. And within that blanket of sphagnum, you've got cotton grasses coming through. You've got things like cranberry with its orange berries just sort of crawling across the surface of the vegetation. And you've got specialists like the sundew that you can see in this slide. So getting in close, here's the sundew itself, really shows you the kind of complexity, the vegetation complexity of our blanket peatland communities. And the reason why you've got things like sundew is because our peatlands are actually very nutrient poor. They're rain fed exclusively, particularly blanket bog. And that means that rain doesn't have a huge amount of nutrients. So it's a very nutrient poor environment that sphagnum, the bog mosses in particular, are very capable of exploiting. And so are some of our slightly more unusual plants like the sundews here, which have, and this was on the David Attenborough Plants Programme recently, have these sticky, gluey tips which will trap insects, and the plant will slowly digest those insects and supplement its nutrients by being a carnivore. So very specialist plants growing on these peatlands. You also get some wonderful animals. We are visited by these regularly when we're out and about doing our survey work, so that certainly the short-eared owl we see very, very regularly. The golden plover accompanies us during a lot of our survey work. It can get a bit wearing because they have a very mournful song, which when you've been listening to it all day can actually really get inside your head, but a beautiful bird, and we wouldn't really miss it for the world. So fantastic bird species up there. So I've already said peatlands cover 3% of the Earth's land and store 30% of all of our carbon. That's over thousands of years of laying it down. The problem is if it's in a degraded situation, you will lose that carbon to the atmosphere. And one of the reasons that stops it degrading is this layer of sphagnum that you will have on the surface. And to me, sphagnum are, I often liken sphagnum to beavers from a rewilding point of view, because they both engineer the landscapes, and particularly wetland landscapes, which peatlands are. So sphagnum species, there's about 34 in the UK, but they hold about 15 to 25 times their weight in water. And by doing that, plus some other unique chemistry within sphagnum, they actually engineer the peatlands and actually make them wetter and more suitable for sphagnum to grow, which then leads to greater peatland formation. So they're a key peat forming species. And because they grow in hummocks and hollows, they help slow the water that's coming off those peatlands. They have to the water has to wind its way around the sphagnum hummocks and hollows. And the reason why sphagnum is so good at doing this is that we used this example for some packaging material that arrived in the office. Sphagnum has living photosynthetic cells, which are actually quite small, but in between them, it has a set of dead cells, which when it rains, just soak up large amounts of water. So we've kind of represented that here, and you can see the ratio of the water holding cells to the actual photosynthetic cells in the sphagnum plant. So that's what a peat bog should look like in its best form. Unfortunately, across the UK, 80% of the UK's blanket bog is in a degraded situation of some form or other. A huge amount of drainage took place, largely funded by government grants. Right up until the 1980s, our peatlands were being drained as an attempt, a failed attempt to improve it for agriculture and grouse shooting. It's been damaged by fire. Wildfires have ravaged quite a lot of our peatlands. We see evidence of that all the time. In the past, very high level grazing numbers will have directly eroded the vegetation surface. And examples of this are some of the images I'm going to show you now. So we estimated that in excess of 7,000 kilometers of what we call grips, so artificial drainage channels, have been cut into Yorkshire's peatlands. And I think you can see here where we've highlighted those drainage channels in green. So those straighter lines are actual man-made drainage. And what that then leads to is certainly we're getting more and more, but in excess of 2,500 kilometers of eroding gullies are present. And you can see this again in this slide. Now, you might think these are natural features, but they're not. We have got evidence of these features starting to appear after the drainage was put in place. And it's because the drainage increases the flow of water in a very kind of channelized way. And then it creates these or opens up these very severely eroding channels. All of that drainage, the man-made and the subsequent gullies, leads to lowering of the water table, drying out the peat, releasing its carbon into the atmosphere, and limiting its ability to continue to form peat. So some of these gullies can be severe. So this is a person-sized gully, and you can see once the erosion started, things like frost and wind and snow will continue that erosion, and you can see the sizes of lumps of peat that will fall off the sides of these eroding gullies and disappear, and they will eventually disappear downstream into lakes and rivers downstream. So we're losing the peat in fairly sizable chunks. We also have areas for a wide range of reasons that have become heavily exposed to the atmosphere, exposed to the wind and the rain and the frost, and those areas have got bigger and bigger, and you end up with these huge flat areas of what is effectively dry carbon gradually being blown away and released into the atmosphere. It's very fragile, it moves around a lot, so no establishment of vegetation unless we help it, and it will gradually all disappear. I think this was caused by a wildfire in the 1940s. So to recap, really, in good condition, we've got a peat system which is a net carbon sink. It stores that carbon forever. If it's in good condition, it will keep taking in carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into that store. It supports a unique and unusual and rare biodiversity. It actually also acts as a water filter. So a lot of the pollutants from the Industrial Revolution, for example, are still locked up in our peatlands and stop from being released into our water systems. And they're also a unique historic, cultural and environmental encyclopedia. So I find it absolutely fascinating that if you took a peat core through one of our peatlands, you can actually detect tephra, which is volcanic dust. So you can use that to date the core, but effectively you've captured any of our historic volcanoes. So for example, you'd be able to find evidence of Vesuvius in Yorkshire's peatlands because those organic dusts travel around the globe and get deposited on our peatlands. And the layering of the vegetation tells us something about the history of our peatland environment. And they support sustainable land uses as well, in terms of potentially farming and other uses like that, and recreation as well. Going the other way, you're doing exactly the opposite. These eroded systems, you're letting that carbon in the form of CO2 back out into the atmosphere. The stuff that's washing off is carbon as well. That's disappearing into the watercourses and disappearing from the peatlands. Once these peats dry out, you lose that unique biodiversity. The sphagnum mosses disappear, the sundews disappear. You lose the historic archive physically, and also you get coloured peaty water ending up in the water treatment works downstream, which Yorkshire Water have to spend an absolute fortune taking the brown colour out, because when they supply their water into the pipes, the water may sit there for a while before it gets to the customer, and therefore has to be chlorinated for health reasons. And if you chlorinate water that's full of carbon, dissolved organic carbon, you create carcinogenic compounds, and Yorkshire Water don't want to poison their customers, so have to spend a lot of money getting that out. And these kind of areas are absolutely no good for farming. They're no good for walking through. They're really difficult. They're really unpleasant environments. So we end up with a system that should be doing us some good, and is doing us a lot of poor service, really. So back in 2008, when I was at the Yorkshire Dales National Park, we decided we need to do something about this. So we joined forces with Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and a range of other partners to fund and coordinate a new programme to try and restore those peatlands, and that's where we've got to now. Really, we're now many years on and delivering that work. What I thought I'd do now is I'd just go through a bit of the process that we go through to get to a point where we're restoring our peatlands. So we do a lot of survey work first. We like to understand our peatlands really well. And we also like to use the best available technology to do that. So we use drones to help us survey the peatlands. And here we are with our fixed wings drones. We don't tend to use these anymore. We've switched to the more helicopter versions, but basically we send these out and it gives us a 3-dimensional topographic map of the peatland, which would be really difficult to get and time consuming on the ground. And it shows us a lot of the topography and detail of our erosion. And you can see that we can then use that information in GIS systems, in some of our technology, to map the way the water's flowing through the peatlands. Quite often, if you're out on a peatland, particularly when it's on the watershed, it's actually virtually impossible to tell which way the water's flowing. But using the technology and the information we get from our drones, we can do that back at base. But we do go out on the ground. We spend a lot of time on the ground walking transects. And if you can see the image at the top where Dom, kind of in the t-shirt with the beard, is holding a box which has got some yellow on it. So these are absolutely vital. These are an essential tool for us. It's like having a pencil now. These are computer GPS devices where we can record all of our information in the field and then upload it instantly as soon as we get to a mobile signal. And that allows us to send that data back to the lab and get moving fairly quickly on it. We can also see Ollie with the blue chimney sweeping pole. So we all carry these, and at regular intervals we stick them in the ground and we record what depth of peat we've got there. And then we record a whole host of information. We record the vegetation communities, we record the types of erosion, whether it's been burnt or whether there's overgrazing. We record the presence of sphagnum mosses, lots of information to help us devise our restoration plans. And to date, we've now got something like 40,000 individual GPS records with all that data. So it's a huge information resource now. Of course, it's not always like that when we're out. This is us planting or attempting to plant sphagnum just as the bees from the east arrived, if anybody remembers that. We stuck it out for a bit longer, but in the end, the bags that had our sphagnum in froze solid, so we couldn't continue. So some of the guys have to go out in some pretty severe conditions to do our survey work. Once we've done all that survey work, we then identify where we need to intervene. And our first job is to try and solve the hydrology problem, block those gullies, block the grips, get the hydrology back up, get the water table back up, and re-wet our peatlands. This is probably the biggest thing, the biggest rewilding exercise you can do on peatlands, is get them re-wetted back to where they should be. And we do that with a whole host of different types of dams depending on the conditions. So if we've got a lot of peat still, we use peat dams, which are built by a digger, a specialist digger that goes out on the moors and creates these dams. That's our easiest and cheapest and quickest and most effective way of doing it. But if and also if we've got areas where we've still got a lot of peat, but it's actually partially vegetating, we don't want to disturb what we've already got through the use of a digger and peat dams, we'll use timber, because you can put them in a bit more targeted way. It's human labor, and it's driving them in with mallets and things like that. So it's a bit more targeted, and we don't have the disruption. So if we want to retain some vegetation that's already there, then we'll use timber dams. But in some cases, the gullies and the grips have eroded so far, they've gone all the way down to the underlying mineral substrate, and peat dams and timber dams won't stick to that, and you tend to get them undermined by the flow of water. So we use these stone sediment traps, so you can see what look like miniature dry stone walls throughout the gullies. These are expensive to install because each 1 meter square is a ton of stone, and the only way to get that onto the moor is to fly it in via a helicopter, and helicopters are ridiculously expensive. So we have to be very, very efficient, and we get a lot done in a day with a helicopter, but it is a huge cost. So it's a big job, a helicopter day. And so far we've blocked well over 1,700 kilometers of moorland grips and gullies, which is a huge job, and it's an amazing result so far. And you can see what happens when in the right conditions, when the blocks work really well. So these have been blocked with peat dams, and you can see the pools behind the dams are starting to slow the flow of the water, and the green stuff in there is sphagnum starting to colonize those trapped channels now and filling it in, and gradually that will turn back into what the rest of the peat bog looks like, which is what we're trying to achieve. We also have these huge hags and gullies which won't heal themselves. They will continue to erode as a result of wind and frost heave and snowdrift sitting on top of them. So what we do with these is we take them from that steep angle and we create a shallower angle, which also allows a bit of that overlapping bit that you can see on there is a bit of turf, and we can spread that over the shallower angle to revegetate the eroded hag. We've reprofiled over 3,000 kilometers of eroding hag or gully since we started. I think there should be a little picture of a digger actually reprofiling here, just a snippet, so you can see the way they're kind of taking the vegetation, reprofiling the peat, and then moving the vegetation around. Sorry, it didn't last very long, that one, but you can see to one side you've got the bare peat, and then the other side they've moved the vegetation over the top of it and effectively stopped that erosion instantly. But some of our gullies, we don't always have enough turf to do that kind of repair. So we do actually have to bring in a lot of materials to try and get some vegetation onto our bare peat. So we use a lot of what we call heather brash. So this is where we go to another moorland and we'll cut heather from a mossy sward, so we get a bit of heather brash, so the stems of the heather, and within that we've got not sphagnum, but some of the other mosses that you would see on a dried out peatland, and we get those mosses mixed in with that brash, and we spread that onto the bare peat. And in doing that, that kind of acts as a mulch, which protects the peat that's underneath it, but also allows us to put some grass seed, some lime, some fertilizer to get some vegetation growing onto the peat. Once we have the vegetation growing on the peat and we've stabilized that bare peat, we can then go in and start to get what is the real vegetation that we would like to see on those peatlands. And in the main, for us, that's cotton grass, and we plant hundreds of thousands of cotton grass plugs, but crucially and more importantly, to get the sphagnum mosses back into those peatlands to start that peat forming process all over again and repair the damage. And again, we're planting hundreds of thousands of sphagnum plugs. So where we have got to, so to date, and this is up until March 2021, we're in the season at the moment for this year, so we'll report again on this next year, but across the Yorkshire Dales, North York Moors, Forest of Bowland and South Pennines, we have over 36,000 hectares of, I should say, we think there's about 80 to 90,000 hectares of peatlands in Yorkshire, and we've got over 36,000 in our first stage of restoration. The reason I describe it like that is because restoring peatlands isn't a one-hit job. It takes probably 10 to 15, maybe it'll take 20 years of repeat visits to get it absolutely right, to deal with all of the things we come across. It's an extreme environment, and sometimes our treatments don't work first time round. So we don't say we've restored peat. We say that in very rare circumstances. We say we've got peat in restoration. So that 36,000 hectares is in restoration. We're going back to revisit some of those sites even now with new techniques and additional measures to keep that process going. So that's about 38% of the total blanket bog in Yorkshire. And as I say, many sites will need that second phase. Now, with COVID, you might think we slowed down a bit. Actually, COVID was our busiest year yet. It was tough. It was difficult. We had to change the way we worked. We had to buy more vehicles because we couldn't share vehicles. And every so often, teams would go down with COVID and work would grind to a halt. But we actually managed to survey nearly 7,000 hectares, drew up restoration plans for nearly 6,000 and delivered restoration work over 5,000 hectares, which, as I say, is our biggest year by far. And it is actually a remarkable effort by the team. And we were also extremely successful over that period with raising a whopping £8 million for the next phase. So we have a fair amount of money to keep going. So I've set out the range of sources we get our funding from here. There's a few more besides as well. Most importantly, the government itself launched its Nature for Climate fund this year, and we were successful in that. And we've now got a £4.8 million fund to keep doing what we're doing, which is fantastic news. So what are our next steps? Well, quite often I find, having worked in conservation for a long time, when you put funding bids together, it all has to be new and innovative and come up with new ideas and new initiatives. But when it comes to peatlands, we need to do more of the same. So we just need to keep going. We've done 38%. We know how to do this. We just need to keep plugging away at the other 62% and get that done. But we are reaching a point where peatlands are now very popular. There's a lot of problems all over the country, and there are lots of people trying to do something about it, which is great news, but it brings the problem that we now have a big lack of capacity in specialists, in contractors, in materials, so people growing sphagnum or cotton grasses. And also it becomes a little bit disjointed. We all start competing with each other for those supplies and resources, and we also almost compete with each other for funding. So myself and colleagues from Moors for the Future, who are our sister project in the Peat District in the South Pennines, and the North Pennines AOMB, came together and created a new initiative called the Great North Bog, which is basically about us all getting together and working more collaboratively to scale up what we do for peatland restoration across the north of England. And we then brought in 3 other peatland restoration partnerships that are perhaps not as advanced as us, but have been doing good work on the ground. And we're working with them to help them get to the stage we are. So Cumbria Peat Partnership, Lancashire Peat Partnership, and Northumberland Peat Partnership all are part of this big Great North Bog Coalition, which has hit the mark. Actually, the government's behind it. Even Boris Johnson mentioned it in a speech, and we're getting a lot of support for that project. If that works, it will basically restore 92% of England's upland peatlands across 7,000 square kilometres and 400 million tonnes of carbon stored. And we're going to try and do that by 2030, 2035. So that's our next target. The Nature for Climate Fund was the first coming together of some of those partners to deliver the Great North Bog. We're leading it at Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, but it's in partnership with the North Pennines AOMB and with Yorkshire Water and a private landowner, with the University of Manchester working with us on the monitoring side. Other partnerships have also put bids in to help them do some of the survey work in preparation for future capital work in the next year or so. And we will all be working together to continue to secure the funds for that project. So it's a really exciting new initiative to take peatland restoration to a new level. So with that, thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Tim, that's wonderful. Thank you. We do have a fair few questions already, and if others would like to ask them, please put them in the Q&A rather than in the chat, and I'll try and keep track of what's coming in. First question, Tim, just while you mentioned at the end there, the Great North Bog, would lowland bog be included in any of the plans, or are you really focused on the uplands? So
lowland bog is part of the bigger picture in terms of peatland restoration. We made the decision with the Great North Bog that we would make it all upland, simply because over such a large area, it's complicated enough with the number of stakeholders and partners. And actually some of the issues in the lowlands and the type of people you work with are slightly different. So you tend to work with things like the lowland drainage boards, with much more with local authorities, whereas in the uplands we'd probably deal more with private landowners. So the decision was made to keep the two separate. However, Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, for example, is also working on lowland projects. So we have Nature for Climate funding now for further work on the Humber Head levels and expansion of the Humber Head levels. And we're also doing some pilot work looking at peatlands in the Vale of Pickering, and also in the east in the chalk stream area, actually, which you wouldn't think there's peatlands, but there are peaty pockets over there. So we're gradually developing in the lowlands as well, but it's parallel rather than part of the Great North Bog.
Thank you. Quite a few comments coming in, Tim, about how wonderful and inspiring that talk has been, by the way.
Thank you.
Question on grazing animals. Would there naturally have been grazers on the peatlands? If so, what type of animals, or would it have been too wet, do you think?
I mean, going right back, we don't know. We don't really know. I think looking at the best mimics you have for peat, so sheep are all over them. I don't think that would have been particularly good. I think they're there because the bogs are dried out a lot. Cattle don't like the wet bog, so probably wouldn't have been on the wettest bits, but may have been on some of the drier areas. We're actually, we have a couple of sites where degraded peatlands going into restoration, cattle have actually been quite beneficial in helping us keep some of the more competitive species of plants at bay while we get the other stuff in. I think if the bogs are in really good condition, then I think herbivores, heavy herbivores, would be unlikely. But we do get deer. We'll get and we get other mammals. We seem to be getting increasing records of otters on some of our high watershed peatlands, which suggests that they're coming into them for some reason. Maybe frogs, for example. But yeah, it's good.
Thank you. And lots of people keen to help. So things about, can volunteers help either with growing plugs or fundraising or campaigning? What's the main need? Assuming there might be a limited number who could be out in February in the Beast from the East, actually.
Yeah, so we're trying to develop this further because we're probably guilty of not involving as many volunteers as possible. We've just got a funding source that's going to allow us to coordinate that more. So we think there's several things people could get involved in. I mean, fundraising is great. You can do that, not necessarily directly to the Peat Partnership, do it through some of our partnerships, so through Yorkshire Wildlife Trust, who hosts us. And we did a big appeal a couple of years ago, and that was very successful. So that works. We would like to use volunteers out in the field to plant sphagnum, but it's tough work, and climatically it's dangerous work. So the cost of us, we'd have to provide facilities for people, and the cost of that probably is prohibitive. But we're still looking at that where we can. The big area where we would like to develop the involvement of people, and we're just starting that project, so you'll start to see this more and more, is around citizen science. So we've got a network of a method that's been developed by the IUCN UK Peat Partnership called Eyes on the Bog, where we put certain simple practical things into the ground that allow us to monitor the peatlands in the long term. And we'd like to eventually recruit an army of volunteers that could go out and check those stations for us, and that would be really, really important work. So I think the answer is watch this space. We will be coming to you for volunteers in the near future.
Yes, me, sir. Good. A bit about sort of once the peatland is in a better health, do you anticipate a certain amount of succession of dwarf shrubs and sort of scrub trees to develop, or does it vary? Yeah,
so there is a debate raging about peat and trees, and compatibility between them, particularly with the carbon story. So our view is we certainly don't want people to plant trees onto peatlands. I think the view is, if our peatlands were hydrologically intact, as in functioning properly, a properly functioning peatland it'll be very wet, but it will have some drier bits. So if trees by natural regeneration got established onto those drier bits, then to me that's a natural process, and we should support that. Our problem in Yorkshire is there's virtually none of our peat that's hydrologically intact. So until we've done that job, we would be a bit cautious about trees being on peatlands. That said, one of the problems we have is the edge of our peatlands are usually at the top of a big steep slope, which would normally, presumably when these peat formed, would have been clothed in trees. And we kind of think that the edge is vulnerable to the wind because it's no longer got any shelter. So we'd certainly support increased trees on those slopes up to the edge of the peat. you can see it if you go to Tierra del Fuego in Argentina. You can see the bog in wet years spreads into the surrounding woodland, and in dry years the trees spread onto the bog, and it sort of breathes in this kind of way. Whether that's ever happened here, we don't really know, but it feels like it would be a useful thing to do. So I think that's where we would like to get to, is a hydrologically functioning bogs with trees where they would be naturally.
Brilliant. Yeah, it'd be lovely to see that kind of dynamic working, but maybe a little way off. You mentioned the use of drones for surveying. Is there any scope for either seeding or plug planting somehow using drones in near future?
I mean, there might be. They'd need to be. One of the things with our plugs is you need to get them firmly in the ground because they get pushed out again by the frost. So your drone would have to be able to sort of kind of plant them, as it were. So I don't know about that, but seeding is possible. But that would be a big drone carrying a payload. Ours are actually, we're going the other way with ours. We're going to sort of pocket-sized drones that we can carry with us and just send off when we need them.
Thank you. What effects have you seen so far on wildlife? Have you observed more species coming back or becoming more common, or is it too early in the survey cycle?
Yeah, so I mean, for the sites that we restored a long time ago, so 10 years in now and more, we're starting to see the proper bog communities developing. So a lot of sites are getting sphagnum that we haven't planted, so they've started to colonize well. You're getting that diversity of bog asphodel and cranberry and some of the other dwarf shrubs in there. So plants wise, where we've got restoration, that's working very well. In terms of other forms of biodiversity, we haven't had the resources to do detailed monitoring, but anecdotally, I mentioned the otters. We seem to be seeing more and more evidence of otters on our sites for some reason. So that's encouraging. Lots of dragonflies. I'm always amazed at how many dragonflies seem to appear around the bog pools that we're creating. And I think I had a chat with somebody at our YWT AGM who I think was going to get in touch with us about the possibility of doing some monitoring for dragonflies. So that'd be really good to see. And then there's a study being done at Leeds that says that invertebrate biodiversity just goes through the roof when you re-wet and restore peatlands, and that's got to be good for the breeding waders that are up there as well.
Yeah. I did like your line about sphagnum being like beavers in terms of that impact on the ecosystem, because certainly around beaver ponds, insects and so on and everything that follow go through the roof. Different stakeholders then, from walkers to farmers to private landowners to grouse moor, we need to touch on at some point. How easy do you find it getting private landowners on board?
So I'll be absolutely honest, back in 2008, when I was at the National Park and thinking about setting this project up, and I thought, well, we're never going to get permission to reverse all that drainage. But I've been surprised at how willing landowners have been to accommodate us, and 99% of the sites that we wanted to work on, we've been able to work on, and we've gone from just blocking drains to planting sphagnum to talking about different ways of managing over the years, and each time the landowners have responded positively to that. They don't always agree on the methodology or how wet it's going to get, but they have been generally supportive in that sense. So I think I don't have any complaints on that front.
And unsurprisingly, there are a few comments and queries about grouse moor management and burning.
Yeah, so burning is obviously the big controversial issue. There's a big debate about burning on. So our focus is on peatlands, so I'll only comment on burning on peatlands. So we support the move to limit burning to exceptional circumstances where you've got good reasons for doing it if there's a conservation need, which is what the Natural England legislation is now. Slightly surprised that it's just restricted to the protected areas, because there's a lot of deep peat outside those protected areas, and I don't see the difference. So we might be communicating with them about whether that extends further. The science behind all of this is very kind of weak on one side or the other, but our observations are that if you can avoid burning a peatland, it will recover quicker.
Thank you. I'm glad you're giving full answers to these. I'm trying to keep track of the 20 questions we've already had. They just keep coming in and you're giving such full answers. It's wonderful. Thank you. An interesting one about your take with the stage you are in the project. It's really inspiring work, but when you go home of an evening, do you feel optimistic about the progress you're making or pessimistic about kind of the state you're in now and what's still to do?
Oh, well, that's an amazing question. I mean, to be honest, when I go home, I probably start working again on the peatlands. I'm so obsessed, but optimistic, I think, because 2008, when we set this up, we thought we would just restore the one big eroding site that we spend a lot of time on, which is Fleet Moss in Wharfdale. That was our target, to do something about that. And yet we're 30-odd thousand hectares later, and we think we can get round all of it. So to be able to do that, I'd like to do it faster. I get very disappointed when some of our techniques don't work first time, because that means we've got to go back again. But yeah, I'm optimistic. And, whatever you say about governments, I'm not political, but, we have a Nature for Climate Fund that's contributing millions of pounds to peatland restoration. That's never happened before. So it's good news. And
do you have a view as to how much you need to do the whole lot of the Great North Bog?
200 million.
Right. So you do have a figure.
Yeah.
Straight off the top of your head.
Yeah, that's what we're pushing for. And the other bit of optimism is that the private sector, so the corporate sector, is coming in and starting to make noises that 200 million pounds isn't really that unthinkable. So again, fairly optimistic.
Thank you. I think we've got through the majority. I'm just recapping over questions where I've sort of asked a combined question, but seeing if there are any specifics. Yeah, a question about the effect of heather on our uplands. So we've talked very much about the mosses, and you did mention cutting heather and some of that. What effect does heather have as part of the mix?
So on a wet, a fully functioning bog, heather wouldn't be as abundant as it is. So the fact that our peatlands are drier, then heather is perhaps more abundant than it should be. And one of the implications there is that heather is very flammable. So there's that danger of wildfire, and that's one of the debates we're having about, burning, managed burning versus not burning, is the control of that heather growth to prevent wildfire. Problem is, you burn heather and it stimulates heather, so it's kind of a bit of a difficult scenario. So we would expect it with our re-wetting programs that the cover of common heather, so Calluna vulgaris, would decline in those wetter areas. But I think generally the science and the evidence is that you don't need 100% cover of heather to be able to maintain, the food you need for, say, a grouse population or something like that. So a reduced cover wouldn't be too harmful. There's some research that suggests that the roots of heather actually, when they're in dry peat, dry it out a bit further, which may exacerbate the drainage problems. But all of this science is a little bit flaky in places.
It's tricky, isn't it, when you're going into sort of new spheres, and it takes quite a while for the years of survey to build up the science conclusively.
Yeah.
But I'm sure as you're out on the moors, you start observing things.
Yeah.
Use of peat in horticulture. Any insights of how to make inroads in that, which just seems a crazy situation when you look at what the peatlands can do for us?
Yeah, so this is where my optimism dissipates. It's crazy. We've been calling for a peat ban for a long time. I mean, there's a big fuss now, but I mean, we've been there throughout my career, really, trying to get the use of peat in horticulture banned. I think there's a big education exercise. I was looking on Twitter the other day, and there's a couple of people there saying, I thought all peat sold in, all compost sold in garden centres was peat free, and they just didn't realise. So there's an education job we can do still. Thought we got there, but we're not quite there. It needs banning. We just need to stop it. Because the problem is we may be reducing the amount of peat that's being dug up for horticultural purposes in the UK, but we're now going further afield and getting into pristine bog environments in the Baltic states and further than that, and it's just causing that damage. So vehement, don't use it in your garden. Don't buy plants from garden centres because they're grown in peat. There's a big list now on the internet of nurseries that grow plants peat free, so you can order them online. There's some very, very good companies producing alternative composts now. There is some debate about the source of things like coir and whether the alternatives are any better. So the other part of it is to just use less compost. People put compost onto general beds, and you don't need it. Target it, use it carefully, use it sparingly. It's a really important resource, so let's treat it like that.
Well, Tim, that's a brilliant presentation followed by some wonderful answers to many questions. About 100 people have been on this evening, so I think you've inspired and enthused all of us. Some great lines out of there. I mean, you took me back 30 years to my first Yorkshire water project, looking at colour in water coming from peat. So still going on, a bit less tech than there is now, I think, at that time. And I was just taken by the pollution being locked up, so you can kind of spot the ash from Vesuvius in Yorkshire, which just blows your mind to go that far back, and also the current bit. And there are loads and loads of messages from people saying how they want to help, and the brilliant presentation. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
Our next presentation, as John mentioned, for Yorkshire Rewilding Network is on Tuesday, the 15th of February. That'll be Paul Jepson. And just to re-emphasize what John said at the start, we do aim to keep these kind of things free access for everybody so that we don't exclude people. What it does also mean that we ask, if you can afford to donate a little bit, please do so through the Yorkshire Wildlife Network's website. Big fans of Yorkshire Wildlife Trust and everything Yorkshire Peat Partnership is doing, Tim, but thanks personally to you for doing tonight's presentation.
You're very welcome.
And we'll record this and put it up on our website in the next few days. So if you've got friends who you think would like to see this, please tell them and they'll be able to come and see it. Thanks, everybody.